I want to welcome everybody to the session. This is on preferential trade agreements, and I'm Mary Burfisher. I am a senior education advisor at GTAP, and I also want to welcome Erwin Corong, also from the center. Erwin is going to be our host, and his role is to keep us on time and to handle any technical issues that we might encounter. So before we get going, I want to add a few housekeeping details. First of all, unless you are the speaker, I ask that you mute your mics. The structure of the session will be that we'll have presenters make their presentation for 20 minutes, and Erwin's role will be to keep that on time. So he'll give our speakers a 2-minute warning when their time is about up. And then that'll be followed by 10 minutes of discussion for each paper. You can put your question in the chat mode, and I'll read the question and let the presenter respond, but you can also raise your hand. And then once again, Erwin is going to give us a 2-minute warning on when the discussion period ends. Then we'll have a 2-minute transition that gives our speakers time to get their PowerPoint up and share their screen. And then we'll go on from there. So we have 4 presenters in our session. And our first presenter is Joe Balagtas. And just to give you a little bit of background on Joe, he's an associate professor of ag economics at Purdue. Before joining Purdue, he served as a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House, and he was a Peace Corps volunteer. So Joe's paper is going to focus on explicit purchase targets, which is a relatively new type of NTM that's being used in preferential trade agreements. And he's going to be analyzing the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade agreement that included this instrument, and that was signed earlier this year. So welcome, Joe, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mary. Let me share my screen here. All right, and I think you guys should see my title page. Is that right? Just to make sure. Okay, so thank you, Mary, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for organizing. This is joint work with Erwin, who's also our host today, it stems out of work that I did in the White House a couple of years ago, working on this trade deal, and yeah, just looking back now 2 years at the first 2 years of the trade agreement, and thinking about whether or how much of a difference it made. And so I'll provide a little bit of background on trade, on the Phase 1 trade agreement. I think many of you are familiar with it, but then we'll move quickly to some results that we can discuss. So what is the Phase 1 trade agreement? First of all, we're looking just at agriculture. The Phase 1 trade agreement covers large swaths of the U.S. and Chinese economies. We're just looking at part of it, an important part politically, but just agriculture, right? And the main thing people focus on, I think rightfully so, in this agreement are the purchase targets, right? So China agreed in the Phase 1 agreement to an additional $12.5 billion of U.S. ag imports, right, in 2020, and another $19.5 billion in 2021, right? And those are additional imports over an agreed upon base, which was the 2017 year, right? As you see here in the panel on the right, all right, these are big increases over the 2017 base year. It's 50%, 52% increase in China's imports from the U.S. In 2020, and an 80% increase, 81% increase in over the for the second year of the agreement, right? So it's a big commitment. I think people, lots of people, rightfully, I think, were skeptical that the targets were realistic, and so part of what we're doing today, I think, or in this paper, is thinking about sort of how big are these targets, and what would it take to meet them, right? There are lots of other details in the agreement that I think maybe are relevant, but they're really hard to quantify. So China agrees to all kinds of structural changes in agriculture, how they change to how they manage their import quota, changes to how they regulate biotech, how they regulate food safety, changes to how they support agriculture domestically, right? So these are structural changes, potentially important, really hard to quantify. So everybody focuses sort of on the purchase targets, which are something that we could all see and observe and understand, right? I do remember I had a conversation with someone high at USTR at the time, and we were talking about the purchase targets, and I said it's kind of a strange way to think about ag trade or about trade. And this person's interpretation, and I don't know if I believe it or not, but this person's interpretation was these purchase targets are a way to verify whether China's making these structural changes. So we can't verify whether these structural changes are being made, but if they're doing them, we, the USTR at the time, think that these purchase targets are achievable, right? So that's how at least one person relatively high up in USTR in the Trump administration was thinking about these things, right? So what happened, right? Here we are in 2022. We could look back. Actually, before we look at whether they met them, give you a little bit of context, right, about what was happening leading up to the trade agreement, right? The U.S. share of China ag imports peaked right around here, 2009, right, at 27% of total of China's total ag imports, right? And from there, China's ag imports kind of ballooned, right? They grew very rapidly. U.S.'s share of that shrunk, right? So U.S. in the absolute value was growing, but as a share of total imports was shrinking. By 2017, U.S. U.S. was just less than 20% of China's ag and food imports, right? Then we enter the trade war, 2018, 2019. China has retaliatory tariffs on U.S. imports from the U.S. on ag products, especially just about everything imported from agriculture, and imports from the U.S. drop both in absolute value and in as a share of the total, right? So what actually happened, right? We could look back and see, in fact, that so the gray bar here are the targets, 37 billion total in 2020, 43 billion total in 2021. By the way, both of those would be record highs, right? And these are nominal dollars, but both of those would be record highs. And the short of it is China did not meet those commitments, right? China met 64% of the commitments in 2020, 87% of the commitments in 21. By the way, 37.8 is a record high, right, of ag exports or ag imports from the U.S. to China. Of course, a lot of things were going on a couple months after the agreement was signed, and actually in China while the agreement was being signed, I think COVID is happening, right? And by March 2021, COVID is fully in the United States. So there's huge disruption to the world. And that might explain some of what's going on here, right? But that is one explanation, right? You also might have some remnants of the trade war. So the trade agreement uses 2017 as a base, but in fact, we're starting from a much lower base in 1819 that's influenced by the trade war. So we see a dip right here in 18 and 19 because of the retaliatory tariffs. And maybe just the targets are unrealistic, right? So it's a little bit hard to pin down exactly just what happened, right? And in fact, it's a little bit hard to judge compliance, right? I mean, it's not clear how we're going to judge compliance with the trade agreement, right? Ex post evaluation of the agreement is confounded by the global pandemic and the resulting economic disruptions, right? And so having a trade agreement that's built around the outcomes, the trade flows, rather than sort of tariffs, right? Or non-tariff barriers makes judging compliance somewhat difficult, right? So what we do instead is sort of use GTAP to simulate the effects of phase one without COVID, right? What would the world look if we didn't have this global economic disruption, pandemic? What would this agreement have looked like, right? And basically what we do, and this is similar to what Rob Veenstra had done with I want to say it's Wong at ITC, was model the agreement, the purchase targets as import subsidies. Calculate the import subsidies that would allow China to meet phase one targets, and we do that same thing, although in a different modeling context, right? And once we do that, what we're interested in partly is trade creation versus trade diversion, right? How much of this agreement is increasing China's consumption of agricultural goods, increasing trade in agriculture, and how much of it is just shifting China's imports away from Brazil and towards the United States, right? That's what we're after here. As I mentioned, Veenstra, I'm sorry, I said Wong, but Veenstra and Hong in 2021 did something similar. They estimated China's import demand, right, and simulated or calculated the subsidies that would be needed to meet the targets, right? And what they find is 42%. They need a 42% subsidy. China would need a 42% subsidy to meet, given the demand system estimated by these authors to meet the target in 2021, and a bigger one, 60% subsidy, 59% subsidy in 2021, right? Importantly, Veenstra and Hong assume here 100% trade diversion. Right, so they're assuming that every additional dollar China spends on U.S. imports is $1 less spent on imports from Australia or Brazil or Europe. There is one other paper that's worth mentioning here. That's Mohammed, Smith, and Grant in 2021. And one thing they note, and they're writing in 2021, so they're just looking at the 2020 data. And at the time, there were increases in China's imports from the United States for certain products, corn in particular. but in soybeans, which comprise, I think it's a quarter, a large percentage of China's ag imports to the United States, there was not much movement. And basically they say, look, for China to have any chance at meeting the targets, they're going to have to make progress in the big area trade areas, right? So that'll come up in how we model this. So we're using GTAP version 7 that allows us to, if we want, disaggregate the GTAP sectors into HS6 components. So for example, that allows us to isolate soybeans, pull soybeans out of the oilseed sector, pull corn out of the grain sector, pull cotton fiber out of the cotton sector, which also includes, I think it's seed. And so I don't present HS level results today, but that's part of what we're trying to do here. And we're also using the version 11 database, which just came out. And that's nice for us because that uses 2017 base year, which happens to be the base year for the phase 1 agreement. Right? Oops, lost it. All right. I'll race past the other details here because I think many of you are familiar with GTAP. I'll just say, well, so we include all 15 sectors, right? We focus on agriculture, so I'm only going to show you results for the highlighted sectors here. We pull out Brazil and Western Europe, US and China, and then lump everybody else together in the ROW. Okay. All right, so here's what we do. If you remember, the phase 1 targets are an additional $12.5 billion of ag imports, U.S. imports in 2020, and an additional $19.5 billion in 2021. Those numbers are right here and here, right? And so what we've got here in this table is the base trade flows. These are U.S. exports to China, ag exports to China in 2017. What we have here is 2020. We've got the purchase target, which is an additional $12.5 billion. And what we do is we allocate those purchase targets to these 6 ag sectors, right, based on the 2017 shares. And what we're going to do is in 2020, right, we're going to force China's imports from the US to meet these targets, right, to grow by this much, right? And then we'll calculate the endogenous subsidy required for China to meet those targets. Right? We do the same thing in 2021, except the target's bigger, right? So we allocate this $19.5 billion across these 6 categories, proportional to the 2017 base trade flows, right? And then calculate the subsidies China would need, the import subsidies China would need to meet those targets. Okay. So these are our shock values that we introduce into GTAP.
5 minutes, Joe.
Yep. So here's our here are the implicit subsidies needed to meet those targets, right? Again, we have the 2017 base tariffs in the base year. In 2020, what we find is that you'd need, the way to read this is a net subsidy of 2.1, a gross subsidy of 2.1% on grains for China to meet its purchase targets, a 12% subsidy in oilseed, so mostly soybeans, right? Since we're starting from a tariff of 3%, basically what we're saying is you need a 15% subsidy from the base to not only reverse the tariff, but to actually have a net subsidy in order for China to meet the target, right? to do a trade-weighted tariff or subsidy for for all of agriculture, right? What we find is that you'd starting from a tariff of 5.8%, right? Basically, you'd need a 16.5% subsidy, so a net subsidy of 7.7% across all of agriculture for China to meet the target, right? It's about double that, a little less than double that to meet 2021. Okay, so these are the implicit subsidies China would need to meet its purchase targets for the phase one agreement. Here's more results for 2020. So now we're looking at U.S. exports on the left. These are changes in quantity, quantity exported for the various sectors to various countries, right, from the U.S., right? Over here on the right, we have prices, and what you see is almost all of the actions in quantities. So basically, GTAP has built into it really elastic export supply and import demand. So all of the changes are in quantities. These are percentage changes. So this says U.S. exports of grains to China increased by 53%. U.S. exports of oil seeds increased by 49%, 50% as well, right? Of course, to meet those targets, U.S. pulls grain out of the rest of the world, right? And you end up with a net total exports from the U.S. for these various products. That's a little bit smaller than than the net or the bilateral trade flow, right?
2 minutes, Joe.
Yep. One other result here. This is China's imports from again in 2020 from the U.S. Right. Again, we see all of the action happening in quantity. And here's one important finding, right? China's total imports increase. So this is in contrast to Feenstra's assumption that there's all 100% trade diversion. The subsidy lowers overall prices in China. They import more stuff, right, across all countries, right? They import less from Brazil, from Western Europe, rest of the world. So there's some trade diversion, but it's not complete, right? So China's total imports increase a little bit. I could show you results for 2021, but basically it's similar direction, but just larger in magnitude because the purchase target's larger. Right, so I'm going to skip over 2021 and just summarize these findings. Right, so what we're finding is phase one targets could be met by import subsidies of 16.5%. That's 2020 and 19% for 2021. Right. These are substantially smaller than Rob Feenstra's findings, less than half of 42% and 59%. And we're still trying to unpack how these models differ to get such different results, right? Phase one the phase one agreement increases China's ag and food imports in total, right? There's a big increase in quantity imported from the U.S., only partially offset by trade diversion, share shifting from its different suppliers, and almost all of the actions in quantities with little effect on traded prices. Some future directions. We want to relax the assumption that targets are met in proportion to 2017 trade, right? And there's some, because we're working in the Armington framework, we can't take products with very small shares and blow them up, or with zero shares and blow them up. But there's some things that I think we could do there, or we want to try to do there. We do want to look at welfare analysis, and I think welfare analysis is tricky. In part because although we model these as we're modeling this policy as a subsidy, right? The question is, well, how much of that subsidy really is managed trade or the result of structural changes? So what we're really calling a subsidy may not be a subsidy, right? And so it's not obvious to me that we want to model this as sort of as a traditional subsidy and the welfare effects of a subsidy, right? I think I'm running out of time, so I'll leave it at that. If you want to reach out to either me or Erwin, we'd be happy to discuss. I'll stop sharing my screen there and open the floor to questions. Sorry if I ran a little bit late, Erwin.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. We're open for questions. I don't see any questions in the chat room. Are there any or hands raised? Does anyone have any questions, comments, or reactions to share with Joe? Dominique?
Yeah, so you made the point that the model is highly elastic. So I was wondering if you guys are going to toy around with the elasticities, because the Armington elasticities for GTAP are meant to be long-term, and these are kind of short-term policies you're looking at. So and maybe with lower elasticities, you might get something a little bit closer to Feenstra et al.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I had the bullet there. I just was running out of time and didn't say it. I think doing sensitivity analysis to the elasticities or other structural parameters in the model makes a lot of sense. Yep. I think maybe for the short term, maybe also sort of disconnecting the link to the rest of the economy might have some impact. But for sure, the supply and the export demand and export supply and import demand elasticities, or the demand and supply elasticities are going to matter.
Well, I have a question, if I may. The trade diversion refers to the shift of trade from lower cost producers to the preferred producer, but it also includes a shift from domestic production to higher cost external producers. And I was wondering whether you might, as you continue to work through the results, look at the adjustments in domestic production in China and how that's being shifted toward higher cost imports from the US.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we could look at China's trade with itself effectively within the context of the model. Erwin, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not, for some of these products, soybeans, I'm not sure it's right that the imports are higher cost. But yeah, I think there's certainly some impact on domestic production from the phase one agreement.
Erwin, how much time do we have left in the discussion?
5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Are there any other comments or questions? Okay, if not, I was wondering if Dominique and Erwin might give us a little bit more detail on the model that was used and how exactly the structure of the HS disaggregation works. Is that just disaggregation for trade, or is it also for production and consumption?
So, yeah.
I guess of just generally how that works.
Dominique, you want to go ahead? Yeah, so from the trade side, we break down the trade for that particular GTAP sector. So for example, oilseeds into, let's say, 20 HS components. And then those 20 HS components can either be 20 HS components or further aggregated into, let's say, 2, just like what we do here. So let's say you have one oil seed in the main GTAP model, and then you have 2 additional breakdown in the HS part of the model. So what we do is we take the shares from MacMap, and then do a database procedure so that in the end, the total trade for oil seed in GTAP is maintained, but the shares from MacMap are created. So we do that for trade, and then we do that for each agent in the model. So in the end, it's both. So they're integrated in some sense because the HS components can do on its own. So you can impose tariffs on the HS components, and then it will impact the main GTAP sector to which it is connected to. And then we also do a domestic and import split for those HS components. So it's similar to what we do in the standard model, except that we add further details on the HS components. Dominique?
No, I have nothing to add. That's fine.
Thanks, Erwin. Well, with that, I think we'll close this presentation. I want to thank Joe and Erwin for presenting their work. It was an excellent presentation. It addressed a current policy issue and also introduced some interesting modeling techniques. So thank you both very much. That will move on to our second presentation. This one is by Etienne Berthet. Our Etienne is going to present a paper that he co-authored with colleagues.
Mary, I think it's Ken first before Etienne.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ken, please go
It's
ahead.
okay. All right, thank you. So let me share my screen and all right. Just before making my presentation, I just want to make sure where I am. I'm in Japan. Here we go. And then Tokyo is there. And I'm in Nagoya. Okay. All right. So here I am. And then you can see many different regional districts within Japan. So that's the topic I want to talk to you today. Subnational regions in Japan. That's the topic I want to talk today. All right. So let me start my presentation. Okay. So title for today's presentation is Regional Computable General Equilibrium Model of Japan and the Global Economy. So this is a joint work with my ex-PhD student, Tomo Iwamoto. He's now working at the Fukui University of Technology. So we've been working on this project several years now, supported by research grant from JSPS and also grant from the Environmental Research and Technology Development Fund. And then we presented several different versions of this paper. We got a very useful comment from Shiro Takeda. And also we just had a conference last week in Japan, Aomori. Kazuo Yamada gave us a good comment as well. Okay, so this is the overview of today's talk. Introduction, data inputs, JPM 47 model, and experimental simulations, and some summaries. So introduction, background and aims. Okay, so policies introduced at the national levels may have different impact on subnational regions. Okay, so we are thinking of trade agreement adopted by different countries, national levels. And then, for example, in Japan, we just agreed upon RCEP, which is a largest free trade agreement for Japan, which entered into force this January 1st, right? So those international trade agreements adopted at the national level, but may have different impact on regional level. And also we are thinking of some environmental policies, Paris agreements. Countries have set some targets toward 2030 or 2050. They are trying to mitigate greenhouse gases, but trying to introduce a national policy to mitigating that, but they may affect differently to the regional level. Well, because regional economic structures are different, that's a heterogeneity. Well, these differences are captured in data sets on production, trade, and consumption and investment at the subnational level. To getting these informations, we are using input-output table. Japan as a whole, that's an IO table for Japan, and also all 47 prefectures in Japan, they published IO tables. Okay, so we can take advantage of these informations from national IO tables and also subnational prefectures IO tables within Japan. And our aim for this project to explore linkages between prefectures and global economies by incorporating prefectures into a global CG model and a database. And then we conduct experimental simulations of RCEP for the liberalizing trade and so on. Okay. And then selected literatures. If we look at the single country CG model with regional specifications, there are plenty of literatures and also wide variety of applications. And for example, review articles, McGregor, back in 2010, they pointing at several frontiers of regional CG modelings. And also, we are look at to the term model, which is developed at COPS, Victoria Universities. They pioneered in a CG model with detailed regional structures in it. And they do have a tradition in a COPS CG modeling and database development as well. And they applied TAR model for Australia, US, China, and other countries as well. So we are trying to catch up or trying to learn from the pioneers TAR models for a case in Japan. Even for Japan, we had several studies based upon a multi-regional IO tables. Ban Takeda and also Shirai and also Bundeskarchai and Taguchi, they took advantage of Japanese multi-regional IO tables, built a single country of Japan with regional details in a CG model. But these studies in Japan stopped around 2010 because of official publication of multi-regional IO table in Japan discontinued. So latest, oldest regional IO table we can use for the Japan was back in 2005 for the multi-regional structures in it. And then these are the literatures, and then we think how we can contribute or practical modeling approach contribute to construct multi-regional IO tables by using 47 prefectures IO tables benchmarked 2011, and we extend the GTAP database and a model by breaking down Japan into subnational regions, which is the 47 prefectures. Similar objectives and also literature we can found in a GTAP conference paper, Sandari for Italy, and their works extended to Russia as well. And then our practical modeling approach lead to some experimental simulations for subnational regions within a context of global economy. But our work is still in progress. And there are several things we hope to improve in near future. For example, bilateral trade data information by sector at prefecture level, some information that are missing. Okay, and also domestic trades, transaction between subnational regions, which called outflows and also inflows. Some prefecture didn't report these figures. So we have to come up with some estimations or guesstimations on that one. And we are using some very common tool for estimating bilateral domestic trade matrix using RAS method, which I will explain later. But there's a room for improvement on this estimation as well. And then at this point, we are assuming immobile production factors such as labor and capital, they are not mobile domestically and also internationally. Well, these are a little bit restrictive assumptions. We hope to relax these assumptions in the near future as well. Okay, so let me explain a little bit about some data inputs for this project. Of course, we are starting with the GTAP database version 10. And then starting from the GTAP version 10 database, we are incorporating 47 prefectures IO tables. And also we checked upon the consistency with Japan IO tables as well. And also to estimating domestic transaction matrix or domestic trade matrix, we relied on inter-regional IO table of Japan. And we begin with the benchmark year of 2011 for now. And we aggregated all the IO tables and a GTAP database to match the sector classifications. And we found 39 sectors would be the best match for this project. Okay. And then classification, sector classification starting from the agriculture. We hope to disaggregate more on the agriculture, but given that some differences in sector classification coming from the prefecture level IO tables, we must aggregate it, agriculture into one. But aside that, livestock, forestry, fishing, food, primary commodities there, and also light manufacturing industries, textile to paper products, and also chemical, and also extractions, and also heavy manufacturing industries, machineries and electronics equipment, motor vehicles, transport equipments are available. And also we do have several important services sectors as well. And one thing for the future project, we wish electricity and gas distribution would be disaggregated further. But this is a 39 sector aggregation for now. And once we match and also aggregate a database, we can start comparing prefecture level data against the country level data from the GTAP. For example, GDP for the country level or gross regional product at the prefecture level, we can see that some summary statistics here. Okay, within Japan, well, we can easily guess Tokyo is the largest gross regional product prefectures in the world back in 2011. United States is the largest GDP country. For the export, largest exporter in Japan is the Aichi prefecture, where Toyota's headquarters locates. Aichi is the largest exporter, and China is the largest exporter in the world. Okay. As for the importer, Tokyo is the largest importer, and so United States is the largest importer. Okay, and within Japan, outflow is a domestic export within Japan. Inflow is a domestic import within Japan. Okay, transactions within Japan, the size of transactions are quite a lot. It's very large in a sense. These numbers are coming from Tokyo's. Tokyo's outflows and inflows are pretty much big. So you can see that the number. Okay, so domestic transaction inflow and outflows. There are several issues here. Within Japan, domestic trade is not covered in GTAP database, of course, because GTAP database is based upon a country level. We don't have that data within a GTAP database. So we need to have some information on bilateral domestic transaction by sector for all prefectures. But not all prefecture reports outflows and inflows, these domestic transaction informations. We need to fill in that gap missing information. But given this for outflow inflow totals, we are trying to estimating transaction metrics using RAS method. And then we can think of two estimation approach. One is a very simple RAS method, just given total outflow, total inflow, and then we are assuming uniform weights for these metrics, right? And then going through with a simple RAS method. And then approach B is a gravity RAS method. We can use some gravity estimates and then projected that estimation to get some weights for the prior to conduct the RAS method, okay? But this is just a brief overview for the what's the target for the domestic transaction, okay? Starting from the IT prefectures, right? These are the destination prefectures. On column, on rows, there's the source prefectures, 47. For example, agriculture, manufacturing, and services sectors, right? Looking from the IT prefectures, these light gray colored cells, these are the IT prefectures outflow to the beyond the other prefectures, okay? Looking down from the IT column, okay, IT prefectures column, this darker gray area is the inflow to the IT prefectures. So we are trying to targeting at this Dij as a matrix component to estimate it, okay? And then to do the more conventional last method, if you are using GenPack, so just look up the GenPack manual 11.15 sections. They explain how to proceed the last method with a simple example. Okay, uniform weights as a prior. So assuming we don't know anything, so just putting a uniform weights all over the domestic transaction matrix, simply given that row totals and also column totals. And then these are the constraints to iteration of the last method. Okay, that's the simple way of last method. Or we can use estimates from the gravity equations and then taking that estimates as a prior weights to be used. Okay, RBS for the different way to conducting this last methods. Okay, we tried two things there. Okay, and then gravity estimation, okay, we use only 2005 interregional IO tables, well, meaning that that's a cross-section estimation. It's a simple thing way. We are using PPML, Poisson pseudo maximal likelihood estimator, for the gravity equation with a fixed effect of source prefectures and also destination prefectures. It's a very simple one. Okay, given that the 53 sectors for final demands, weights are computed once we estimate in this simple gravity equations, make some projections with prefectural distance and to get the DIJ. And then taking that projected DIJ between prefectures, we can estimating domestic transaction metrics. And then similar objectives found in a recent article by Fournier Gabriel. So we can refer to their article as well. This is a tentative result from the gravity estimation as expected distance, okay, 1% distance away between the prefecture level, domestic transaction going down by 1.9%. Well, that's we interpret from this estimation result. Okay, so once we got the database and some estimates, so we can start splitting or extending standard GTAP model, classic GTAP model, GTAP book, and then Love McDougall's extensions, and also latest version 7 GTAP models. We are based upon, for this version, the classic model, where we are extending a standard GTAP model. So let me skip the details of GTAP model. Okay.
4 minutes, Ken.
Okay, thank you. And then this blue things, the sub tree or CES aggregator is the one we extended to the standard GTAP model. Okay. In a standard GTAP model, D as a domestic production of goods I in country or region S, okay, is the one. But once we have prefecture details of production, we can add this nest in blue. Okay, so prefecture number 1 through number 47. Okay, their products are differentiated as Hamilton sense. They are coming for composing a domestic composite, right? Domestic composite and import composite coming up to the good composite X, right? So this is the blue part is that we extended in a standard GTAP model. Okay, production structures we didn't change. Intermediate goods and value-added components, labor, capital, natural resources, and land. Consumption structures for the composite goods are pretty much same as before in a standard GTAP model. Only thing we add for the distribution of the output. Okay, since we do have prefecture, output can be distributed across prefectures. Okay, so experimental simulations, we make it simple, but taking recent example from Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP, which is ASEAN 10 countries plus Japan, China, Korea, Australia, New Zealand free trade agreement. We are assuming for simplicity, removing all the tariff and then put some trade facilitation by 10%. Okay, so we intended this simulation to see if the model's behavior. Okay.
2 minutes remaining, Ken.
All right, thank you. We ran a bunch of simulations, well, starting with the standard GTAP with no change. So between the prefectures substitution 0, meaning that was just a Leontief things, and then elasticity parameter is equal to 1 is the Cobb-Douglas shares constant across the prefectures. We try to change the prior weights differences. Okay, A is a simple last method. S4 through 7 use a gravity last method, and then we increase the elasticity of substitution parameter for the prefectures products. Okay, 1 through 2 times bigger than E sub n in our standard GTAP model. Okay, so we run the simulation and then look at the simulation result for the real GDP upper panel and welfare. RCEP and then law, rest of the world stays same almost. But for Japan's case, if we increasing substitution elasticities, Japan's real GDP starts shrinking as a whole. Okay, for the welfare, substitution elasticities start increasing, some increase in our welfare result. Okay, and then where is these things coming from? Of course, we do have 47 prefecture breakdown, so we can drill down which moves a lot. Okay, there's a 47 prefecture result here, but we knew Tokyo is the largest region within Japan, largest prefecture in Japan, and then they moved a lot. Okay, once we allow for more substitutions, Tokyo's real gross regional product shrinks, meaning that they imported within Japan a lot, okay, inflows a lot, okay, and nearby prefectures exporting or domestically exporting to Tokyo a lot. So that's the one thing we observed in here. Okay, for the welfare case, okay, so welfare's case, well, let me just pinpoint Chiba is the next to Tokyo prefectures, very close to Tokyo, just right next to it. Once substitution increased, Chiba's welfare is increased as well. So it must be kind of close relationship within a Tokyo and then Chiba things going on. So of course, we do have 47 prefecture in the result. We need to more to discover or look into the examine the more detailed result. Well, let me summarize the tentative things. So basically, we got a 47 prefecture of Japan into a GTAP model. We extended GTAP database and a model for the 39 sectors, and we conducted very simple trade liberalization scenario. Substitution for some prefecture affect real GDP for Japan, especially for Tokyo as well. And then there's, of course, there are many issues. We need more data on the domestic transactions. And so we hope to extend, improve the gravity models as well. With more information, we can use lots of information available within Japan, so we can take advantage of it. And then after that, we are trying to tackle with some mobility of primary factors within Japan. And also we need to consider application not only for trade policies, but also for energy and also climate policies. Okay, just let me scrolling through the selected references. Okay, so we are depending upon those pioneers and also inputs from many different literatures as well. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I'm going to open it up now for questions. If you want to send them through the chat or raise your hand. Dominique, floor is yours.
Thank you. I always seem to start with the first question at these sessions. Anyway, Ken, I'm very excited about this work. Obviously, from a political economy point of view, I'm not familiar with Japan, but certainly in the United States, kind of the regional impacts of trade agreements are very, very important in determining the success or failure of these negotiations. Just a heads up, we've started a project with Tom Rutherford at Wisconsin-Madison. So we actually have right now a working version of the WinDC database, which is a database for all 50 states of the United States plus District of Columbia. And we've merged that into the GTAP database, and we actually have a running version of what we're currently calling GTAP SR for GTAP subregion. In terms, I think the major difference with the work that you're doing is that we're not attempting to measure interstate trade. So we have each agent in the local economy purchases from the local economy from what we're calling the national market. So we pool all the production from the states into a national market, and therefore, and then the third market, of course, is imports. So we have a national market that pools the interstate trade, but we don't identify bilaterally the producer and the consumer. But very exciting work, and would like to work with you on perhaps on the GTAP SR and your data, because one of the interesting questions is how much information is being lost by using this national market as opposed to using the bilateral trade itself.
Right.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay. Thank you for the comment. It's yes. I knew that project is going on within the U.S. and then led by Tom Rutherford, and then of course GTAP Center is working with him, and then we are pretty much trying to catch up with several pioneers. For example, GTAP Center and also Tom Rutherford and also COPS in our Australia. And then, of course, one of the more difficult or issues is that trade within a country level. Okay, and then as Dominic mentioned, well, of course, we can assume the pool of the national product pool and then how to distribute in that sense. We are estimating pool matrix between the subnational regions thanks to the previous estimates of regional IO tables available within Japan. So we take advantage of that information, and also, but if that information is not available, how much information we lost? That's the question you asked. And also, we are pretty much happy to work with you. And also, I'm happy to, would like to learn from the GTAP as well, modeling as well.
Any further questions, comments?
I just wanted to ask, hi, this is Till from the UK Government Department for Environment. I thought that was a great presentation, Ken. Thank you for sharing. I noticed that in your results, the scenarios 3 and 4, where the only difference is kind of uniform weights of the prefectures and kind of gravity computed weights. I noticed they produced the same results, and I just wanted to know why and whether that kind of implies there isn't much difference between the uniform weights and the gravity estimated weights.
Thank you for that questions. Because we are lucky to have 47 different prefecture level IO tables, and then most of the prefecture reported total of inflow or total of outflow. Okay, so we can use these inflow or outflow total informations to begin with. I think that's the reason why either uniform weights or gravity estimated weights doesn't create much differences in a simulation result. Well, so we are lucky to capture that inflow outflow information by prefecture level, even for the total. That's the one thing reducing that's the differences between the more simple loss and also gravity loss estimation result. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Further questions? Ken, I had a question.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. It's a carefully constructed model that I think, as Dominique said, when you can deliver results on a state level or on a prefecture level, it has a big impact. And I wondered, as you're presenting this to policymakers, for example, in Tokyo, there's a difference in sign between the welfare and the GDP results. So how can you present that to policymakers in an intuitive way that gives them some judgment about how to interpret those results?
Yes, thank you, Mary. That's a very tough question in terms of presenting the result to the policymakers. Well, since we are learning comparative static CG model, and even for the standard GTAP model, sometimes generating different sign. For example, GDP is negative, very small, but welfare is improving. Well, some trade liberalization scenario based upon my experience, so opposite direction pointing at GDP and welfare. From the economist point of view, we should pushing the welfare result to be better measures, but policymakers are often stressing upon the real GDP. And then, but at this point, we didn't present enough details how we can decompose the real GDP result into the each component and then further drilling down what's the negative result coming from. So in a model, we do have all the results. We should be more careful and also more take more time to explaining why we get this result to the policymakers. But one of my colleagues, my school, warned me, when you start dividing Japan into the subnational levels, there are some much more heated debate between the regions. That's are you willing to make? That's one question I got from my colleague in my department. But my point here, more information or more detailed analysis would be better contributed to a national level decision making. That's what I'm hoping to.
Okay, Mary, I think we need to move on to the next one.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ken. It was
Thank
an
you.
excellent presentation. Okay, so our next speaker is going to be Etienne. He's presenting a paper that he co-authored with his colleagues at the Technical University in Denmark. Etienne recently earned his PhD from the Institute, and his research interests include sustainability and input-output modeling. So he brings both of these interests to bear in his paper, in which he's introducing a measure to a way to measure externalities that occur along the supply chain. So Etienne, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, hi everyone. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to present my work today. So just as say, I'm part of the I'm a PhD from the Technical University in Denmark in Copenhagen, and you can see my screen. Can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay. So the paper that I will present you, it's to present a new framework that we have developed recently with a colleague from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, named like the through-flow-based accounting framework. And here I will present you the application to the GTAP database and how it can be used in a further extent to untangle the global trade of different externalities. So, in this paper, so my presentation will be separated in 3 different parts. So mainly to explain why I have been, why the GTAP database can be currently used to evaluate the global value chain analysis. What are the different tools already available? Why I had the idea to apply this through-flow-based accounting to the GTAP database. What is exactly this through-flow-based accounting that I will detail here? And two study case, like one comparing briefly the my GTAP results with another input-output result, ELOA, and also like specifically targeting the greenhouse gases through flow going through the East Asian region. So how GTAP is currently dealing with the global value chain analysis. So as you know, like there is in our world, we are confronted with a current globalized economy, which is characterized by different production process and that are usually long, complex, fragmented in different countries and international. And usually the place where the externalities from the production of a product are generated are not located in the same countries where this product is consumed. So usually there is a gap between those both, and it's difficult to measure this gap, because when we try to use a different framework, to accounting framework to evaluate those externalities, usually it's seen like an externalities which is produced at a producer level, a commodity flow which is arriving in a consumer. And then using like with the input out table and the classic different step with the production based accounting and the consumption based accounting, we can have like the different result. The problem is like the reality is more complex, because when we have like a supply chain which is fragmented between countries and between sectors, we usually have countries with intermediates, with forward linkage and backward linkage between the producer and the consumer all along the supply chain. So the key question is like, how do we evaluate this intermediate? And usually it's like based on the different tools that have been developed for the global value chain analysis. And these different tools, they are like mainly based on the input output table, and by the where we can estimate like the different part of the value added with the domestic value added, among others, the indirect value added, the foreign value added, and the different part of what is the trade in value added, which is involved in this approach. And this is also something which is there is a part on GTAP that have been dedicated to this evaluation of this trade in value added, which is like the GTAP VR value added. So basically, the first step is to transform back the GTAP model into an MREO, and then like by separating the different parts as usually compute into the MREO, we can evaluate this global value chain analysis. So the idea was like when I was confronted to this, it's an interesting approach using GTAP, but there is some last development about the MREO to analyze this global value chain, which are like the income-based accounting, so the between us based accounting. So the first one is the supply-driven version of the consumption-based accounting. The second one is network-based approach, and the last one is hypothetical extraction. And from all of this, we have derivated this framework, which is the through-flow-based accounting. And the idea was like, maybe it could be a good idea to try to apply this through-flow-based accounting to the GTAP database. So to explain you a little bit further, what is exactly this through-flow-based accounting, how it can be used to evaluate the global value chain, and what is different about what is doing right now. So basically, the main idea for this through-flow-based accounting is to evaluate the trade of the different externalities in absence of a country C. So, like, what is to compute the direct and indirect externalities, but once with the whole world and another one with the whole world without these specific countries. Then we get a result which is like, here we get the global volume of externalities minus the global volume of externalities in an hypothetical economy, so where like the country C would not be counted. So you get exactly like everything which is related to this country C. So this is the basic concept of this through flow, which is what gives you like all externalities embodied in the supply chain, but starting from a country C, passing through this country C or ending in country C. So basically you have all the different, you have basically the impacts of one countries on the world economy. So then you can, based on this TB through flow-based accounting, you have all the different externality flows where a country is involved. So local externalities, the ones that are produced in a country, consumed in this country. The import externalities, produce outside and consume, export, and particularly the transport externalities, where they are the produce, the origin, they arrive from the rest of the world, they are transformed in these countries, and then in a country C, and then re-export in other countries for a final user. And you have a tiny part, which are the re-imported externalities, which are basically the externalities exported at some point from the country C and re-import in the country C to be consumed. To be a little bit more clear, I have illustrated with one single country. So, for example, Germany. Here we have like the direct emission. So emission in Germany, this is like the local one. So the Germany for consumption in Germany, the export one from the one generated on the German territories and consumed outside of Germany. You have the import emission that are for goods that have been produced outside of Germany and that for final use inside of Germany. And like the most important, the through flow ones that are like the one imported from the rest of the world, transform in different steps into the German economy and re-export into the rest of the world. So basically, so this through flow-based accounting, it's a kind of good tool to target the different supply chain and how the supply chain connect the different countries together. So basically, what we have done, we have used the GTAP MREO, so directly on the GTAP website, which is the extension of the standard GTAP database, by additional distinguishing bilateral trade flow and tariff flow in order to facilitate the MREO transformation. And the last available that we get, it was for 2014, organized by 10 areas and 10 different sectors. And then what the first step was really to recreate from the GTAP data this part with like into the MREO, so like into the static MREO, the main transaction matrix, the final demand matrix. So following like the description and two proportionality assumption based on the import of the different goods and the allocation of these different goods based on the industry. So proportional allocation. We create this input-output framework, and then what we have done, it's then we could have used like any externalities, an externality from the GTAP database, but it was also to show that it can be used by any externalities, and that's also quite interesting. So what we have done is to use the pre-map database to map the different CO2 GHG emission on these 10 main sectors and these 10 main areas. So based on this, we have reshaping the GTAP as a scenario, integrating these environmental externalities, and apply this TBA. And what we get as a result, it's the following one. So when here you have three different categories. The production-based, each point represents one area, so of the 10 area. In red, you have the PBA. So this is like the emissions based on GTAP result, and we have applied exactly the same step on the EORA result. So we can see that there is like a good. The results are quite similar for both models. So we could think our decomposition. So this step was more to ensure that our reshaping GTAP into an MREO was correct, and it seems to be. So basically, when we study, this is typically the GTAP result. So I think this step is quite important, because here you have like the production on the left. You have the both are expressed in the same unit. So here on the production-based accounting, consumption-based accounting, and through-flow-based accounting, you can see like the difference of the part. You can see that for the TBA, we evaluate more for the different area. A lot of CO2 emission are not count neither in the PBA, not in the PBA, neither in the CBA. It means that this is mainly part due to transported emission, because as we have seen before, you have the local, exported, imported, and transported emission. And these transported emission are quite significant for a lot of countries. So then it's like it's an interesting approach to evaluate in terms of. We can see that overall the TBA framework is able to identify substantially more greenhouse gas emissions than the usual accounting framework, and also here in the East Asia, for example, we can see that is linked with substantially more GHG emissions than just the one generated on its own territory, so the PBA, or the one located outside but supply to generate to supply its final consumption. So basically the CBA. So this is the key point of the transported emission. So what is the flow of embodied externalities going through one country? And then something that we can do here, it's like to make a position on the supply chain by a backward analysis or a forward analysis. We can do it. We can do this quite easily with this new framework, because, for example, on the backward analysis, we can see that the percentage of territorial emission caused by supply chain traversing or ending in East Asia. So here we focus specifically on East Asia. So we can see that this some area have a kind of significant percentage of territorial emission going through or finishing into Asia. And we can say the same like in the forward analysis, like the percentage of air emission going in East Asia to local the final supply demand or going through East Asia. And then we can make the difference between the emission that have been generated on this country or that have been going through. So for example, here we can see that 7% of the emission into the East Asian supply chain are arriving have been produced to supply local final demand in Europe. But on this 7%, 5% are actually generated inside East Asia, and 2% are just going through East Asia. And then this would be really interesting to study further the result, because it's also like here we just have like based on the 10 area and 10 sectors of the MREO, so it's not really detailed, but here we can see that are almost at the same level for the Southeast Asia and the North America, but the sectors are completely different, because here, so both are around 10% of the in a forward analysis, but here it's mainly at the great majority for the extractive industry, which is here like based on way more different industries. So this can be performed at the country level and sector level. So to conclude, I think I'm just on time. I will present the different elements. So something that we have started to do, it's also like we have used this framework because it's kind of easy to adapt it for different externalities. So I present you here like all the transported embodied externalities based on the this is based on the EORA, on the YOD data. But here you have like the greenhouse gases emission. So the transported externalities that are going through intermediate countries, like between the place where they have been produced and the place where they have been consumed. But this can be generalized to any environmental or social externalities. So here on the right, you have the number of work fatalities that are embodied into the different trade flow. So the key message to conclude that given the importance of the global value chain in both in different approach, in different model, and any externalities or value added embodied into trade flow, such approach are now more and more needed to in international trade policy analysis to really target and frame precisely the different effects. And the TBA can be used as an alternative flow-based global value chain analysis to investigate the structures and the interdependencies of a global trade network. And then, as I showed you previously, it's an essential way to target countries that have a large portion of their output going through another countries. And another question that may rise to this presentation is like, why is it as you have to transform it as an MREO before? Is it really interesting? I think in this approach, my view would be it's interesting to have this approach as an ex post. So first computing a general equilibrium model and then analyzing the results based on the TBA computation. But it's just an approach. And in a more broad definition, both dynamic and static model are both good or like pros and cons. And but last, I would say that such combination could be really interesting to formulate policies recommendation on how to increase the resilience of a global trade network. and to understand a little bit more the not necessarily just the trade on the value added, but also like in more broadly on the different externalities and how the trade network paves the way on the safest and fairest trade regime. I think I'm on time, or
Yes,
I
you
still
were
have
perfect.
time, or
No, perfect. I didn't call your
okay,
attention
because I
anymore
didn't tell
because
the
you,
2 minutes. So
no, because you were almost there. That's why I didn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, Etienne. That was an excellent presentation. We're opening it up for questions and discussion. Etienne, you could stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Questions? Erwin, you have your hand up.
Yeah. I don't have a question, just a comment. I saw that you used the GTAP MRAO database, and then in the database, they're arranged into headers, right? And then what you do further is to convert the structure into a flat 2-dimensional file.
Yeah, exactly.
Which you show. When we created the MRAO, we didn't think about that format, but it might be late now, but we've created that 2-dimensional format automatically. So when you in the next version of the MRAO, when you aggregate the database, there's a file which we call a wild format that creates that 2-dimensional format. So
because I was looking for it for quite a long time. I didn't find it, so I recreated myself. But
yeah, we created it a few months, well, towards the end of last year. But eventually it will be part of the MRAO distribution. So
yeah. No, I mean, definitely. I think like my redecomposition is quite correct, because when I compare on other input-output, I got quite of close results. But yeah, definitely it would be interesting also to compare.
No, it was perfect, because I saw the margins on the last column and row, so that makes it at least for the margin side, supply equals demand. So I think you're perfect. Yeah.
Any further questions, comments? Okay, well, Etienne, thank you. It was an excellent presentation, and one of the things that I found most interesting about it was your final slide, where you were reflecting on some of the applications. This is really a very rich framework, and it is a very flexible one in the ability to apply it to so many different kinds of externalities. So
thanks. And maybe just if I can just add really a last word, it's really like I think a question could be like, why doing all of this when we have the GTAP value added that could do actually the same. I think it's really like, here we are in a global interdependency. So we are like, based on this hypothetical extraction, we can get all the value chain from the start to the end. It's not like a bilateral trade flow between countries and analyzed step by step. So I think it's like, it's the same tool, but a different approach. So able to reply to different questions, similar but different. But thanks.
Do you have any specific plans right now for further applications?
Sorry?
Do you have any specific plans right now for where you'll take this?
This work is under review right now in economic of system research, and then when it's validated, and And but maybe like the GTAP specific, it's the publication is with EORA data, but some GTAP application could be quite interesting to perform also.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, let me introduce our last speaker, Dzmitry Kniahin. Dzmitry is a statistician at the International Trade Center and a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Geneva. So in addition to his current work on rules of origin, he contributed to the development of the new market access map and the redesign and maintenance of the ITC trade agreement database. So he brings both of these skills to bear on a specific aspect of the question of trade creation and trade diversion, and that's the effects of a non-tariff barrier, the rules of origin. So welcome, Dzmitry, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary. Hello, everyone. My name is Dmitry. Working at ITC on MacMap with Monder Mimuni and others. So recently we have been moving into new direction to collect and code rules of origin in trade agreements. So let me introduce some of our ongoing work and some of the outputs that we have created recently. So the structure of the presentation will be introduction, description of the database, and some preliminary results and challenges. So as an introduction, so the context is that PTAs are increasing in the number. So there are more than 500 PTAs in force as of today, and many more are in the negotiation. They change the landscape by providing duty-free treatment for PTA products with trade creation and trade diversion effects. But the PTA application on the trade flow is not automatic, and it's in fact subject to rules of origin. Rules of origin, they act as a non-tariff barrier, and they result to many traders not utilizing available preferences. In other words, continuing to trade under MFN tariff instead of paying zero tariff. So many traders actually are not using agreement, and this results in PTA underperformance. So some skeptics even go all the way to say that the governments give preferences with one hand and they take them away with another by applying strict rules of origin. So rules of origin in general define nationality of the product for various trade policy treatments. In the case of PTAs, they try to measure if the product has acquired enough value added to qualify for duty-free treatment and circulate without tariffs within PTA area. Their main purpose is to prevent trade deflection for non-qualifying foreign products, and also for industrial development, especially in the case of restrictive rules of origin, which require a lot of domestic value addition. In terms of their form, they are product specific, so they're highly disaggregated in many cases, and they are typically presented as a percentage rule, as a specific process describing what transformation has to take place inside PTA, or in the form of HS shift or a change in tariff code. And for raw products, typically the rule of origin is wholly obtained, meaning the product has to be entirely grown or extracted from within the country. The database that we have been constructing is called Rules of Origin Facilitator, jointly constructed and maintained by ITC, WCO, and WTO. It consists of an online tool for businesses and also an underlying database. It's an advanced stage covering 82% of all trade agreements by now. And it's mapped with MacMap database on tariffs at the HS6 level. And it can be queried at this tool, findrulesoforigin.org. And notably, the work for US, EU, and Japan PTAs was supported by GRIPS Japan, thanks to the lead of Ken Kawasaki. So what we are after here is actually this rules of origin can be used to extract input-output information. So 70% of PTAs, they relied on HS shift rules, which essentially impose explicit sourcing restrictions at the HS level. For example, in NAFTA, to produce ketchup under this product code, it forbids to use tomato paste from foreign countries under this HS code. In other words, it's a restriction, but for us, it represents an input-output at the HS6 level, which is quite rare and new. And also NAFTA allows to use foreign tomatoes, 0702. So it means that it's a lower stage of transformation. So in a sense, this can be used as a source for input-output information, essentially revealed by NAFTA negotiators. So we have performed this exercise of extracting and matching HS codes in rules of origin for 990 PTAs and produced an IO relationship matrix. So just a short background is that these HS shift rules, they are quite recent. They emerged in 1960s. And before that, policymakers used to use RVC rules, or sometimes they wouldn't even define them. And in North America, they really emerged in 1990s, and they were replicated in many PTAs of NAFTA countries. And today, we can say that RVC rules and this change HS shift rules are the most common rules in trade agreements. More than 60% they share, including combinations. That's why it's more than 100% in total. In terms of existing research and the contribution, so currently there is no global input-output matrix at the HS6 level. It's too granular. The initial exercise was performed in the paper of Conconi and other authors in 2018, American Economic Review Journal, where they performed this extraction exercise for NAFTA. So then they use this data set to perform diff regression to find the trade diversion effect on those restricted inputs treated by NAFTA. And they discovered a significant trade diversion effect of 43% relative to unrestricted HS inputs. We have to say that their paper was really influenced by the sample where they only looked at NAFTA, exports of Mexico, and by construction, the indicator mostly looked at apparel sector. For example, automotive sector is not using HS shift rules. So they concluded that PTA has this hidden trade diversion effect on inputs, often overlooked by economists, and sometimes this RO result in some kind of import tax on foreign inputs. So to validate this finding and to allow economists to advance further with this work, we have constructed this similar table for most of the PTAs in the world, and identify an econometric approach to assess a similar impact. So let me move to the actual data. So here we present, we start with an example. So let's consider this rule of origin for USMCA for cotton shirts. And we see the text. So it's an unstructured text, which basically says that to produce this product, including cotton shirts, you should use inputs from any other chapter, but you cannot use all these inputs. Okay. And then finally, there is a requirement to cut and sew the shirt in NAFTA. So what we did is we took out all these HS codes and listed them. Then we analyzed them. So then you can, of course, match it with any available data sets, and you will discover that these codes actually describe yarn and fabric. So these are the most relevant inputs that are not allowed to be used. This makes these rules of origin one of the most stringent in the world. So here we present table 1, which aggregates and summarizes all identified inputs across all available agreements. So we can see here that different agreements, they decide at the different level of disaggregation for inputs. So USMCA decided to put, for example, Chapter 54 entirely as a restricted input, while some other agreements like Colombia, Israel, they were a bit lighter and they just decided to put a few HS4 codes or some HS6 codes on restriction input. So there are different approaches, but in any case, we managed to identify this code as a likely input into cotton shorts. It should not be confused by man-made synthetic material, because cotton short can be using synthetic materials. It's still a cotton short. So here is an example for older agreements using different revision. We can see that US agreements are really keen on putting this Chapter 54 inputs into restriction list, and other agreements are usually not doing it. In other agreements, this input is unrestricted. So here we provide a reference table with the variables, which basically match output and input HS codes, and they list impacted agreements. Finally, the second table, it's a harmonized table where we actually converted all the different HS codes into a single revision, 2017. And we expanded all the codes to HS6 level. So now it's an HS6 proper matrix. And in this matrix, we put a restriction dummy saying if this input can be used or cannot be used to qualify for rule of origin. So in the case of USMCA, we see that all these ER HS codes are restricted. So this is a raw cotton. It's not restricted. And then we see HS codes for yarn again. These are restricted HS codes. So we additionally provide for reference name of the agreement and the link to access the texts just for general verification, including so-called maps of the distribution of types of rules of origin in the agreement. And here you can find the list of variable names for this dataset number 2. So currently we are conducting research to understand the impact based on past trade outcomes of these restrictions. And from the initial assessment of the data, our first conclusion is that negotiators do not always put an effort to draft very precise HS restrictions. In fact, because they are not, it's not in their job resumes often to disclose all the possible inputs to the product. So sometimes they're a bit lazy and they just define them at HS2 level or HS4 level. So it has a lot of garbage or noise, whereas some of the HS6 codes are clearly impossible to be used. Second of all, we see a lot of copy-pasting behavior. So we see that many rules of origin in US FTAs, they're almost like plagiarized from one another. So this reduces the variation in the data, but it also asks us a question if drafters actually really pay attention when they draft and define those HS inputs in the rule. And finally, in some other regions like Europe, we see some strange inputs on restriction lists. For example, in EU PTAs, we often see sugar. So in food products, now sugar is not the main input in in food products, but it's probably there because this is a politically sensitive input, and just the negotiators want to make sure that the sugar is only used the local sugar. This also creates some noise in our assessment of main inputs. So because of that, we tried, but we could not yet identify coefficients in this input-output matrix to identify how much of each HS6 code enters into the product. Using incidence rules by saying that this input seems to be the most popular across all FTAs is one approach, but again, it introduces noises by putting some sensitive products into these lists, which are not main contributors to the value added. So another aspect is we try to perform analysis for ASEAN, and unfortunately, ASEAN agreements and in general agreements in Asia Pacific, they use alternative form of rule of origin, which means that a trader can opt for a second rule, RVC 40%. In other words, the restriction which is imposed by HS shift rule can be disregarded, and RVC rule can be used instead if trader desires so. So in fact, we don't know the outcome if the trader actually complied with this restriction rule, or the trader managed to somehow change the mix and put some a bit more labor and achieve this value-added content. Another difficulty we faced, similar to CONCONI in USMCA and NAFTA, there are sometimes combinations of rules where, in addition to HS shift, there is an RVC rule, sometimes a very high rule, like 75% for cars. In that case, we wonder if this HS restriction is actually binding, and actually there are some additional self-imposed restrictions produced by this very high RVC rule. So an additional challenge is the spaghetti ball of PTAs. So the original FTA studied was NAFTA, but it was like one of the very few early PTAs in 1990s. Since then, there are multiplications of PTAs with an overlap, such as USMCA is overlapping with CPTPP for Canada and Mexico. And this creates additional noise where traders can choose between agreements and take different factors to decide with which input restriction bundles they would like to comply more. So this requires additional filtering out overlapping PTAs, which is like taking out a lot of PTAs nowadays. In terms of the table, it's huge because there is a big number of potential inputs that can go into a product. Some additional activities we tried at ITC is to remove some products using keyword match. For example, for orange juice, we would like to match it on oranges and eliminate all other irrelevant fruits like strawberries and tomatoes and so on. But the problem is if you go automatically with this approach, we would also pick products using orange as a color, such as some industrial products. And this would be clearly a mistake. And additional work would be to validate, and we are doing it in Africa with industry experts, to try to sit down and take a specific sector and identify the actual HS6 inputs that are used and assign maybe some indicative weights. But this is manual work and it cannot be scaled up easily. So to conclude, so I would like to say that the existing literature and our current work indicates that rules of origin have this trade diversion effect, secondary effect, impacting trade and intermediate inputs using sourcing restrictions. We counted and identified that 300 PTAs are affected by such HS restriction rules. Other PTAs, they only use RVC rules, so they're not affected, or they use a single across the board rule, which it means it was not tailored to a specific sector or product. This work constitutes the first attempt to automatically build a global input-output relationship at the HS6 level, even though without coefficients. And it also superimposes the actual restrictions and allowances which are imposed by rule of origin in each PTA. So potentially this IO table, with some caveats, of course, can be used as a basis for fine-grained modeling at the HS6 level, including in GTAP. And finally, the restrictions tables for each PTA can be used, will be used, currently being used to assess trade diversion effects in inputs caused by RO in multiple regions other than North America and across multiple sectors, not only chemicals and apparel where the rules were heavy in NAFTA, but also across maybe cars and other sectors, industrial sectors. Yeah. So, and I had another example, maybe since I have a couple more minutes. So another example could be ketchup, a simple example. So we took ketchup and we found that most agreements, they actually keep using the same inputs on restriction list, mostly tomato paste and tomatoes. They don't put glass or plastic. And this usually is explained by another provision, which actually allows to discard or disregard any retail packaging for the product. So that's why negotiators usually never put plastic or glass into the rule of origin. Yeah, and in the case of this restriction matrix, we see that USMC only puts one input, tomato paste, but it's like the main input that allows to quickly process it into ketchup. So it literally implies that the company will have to now start with tomatoes and produce it ketchup. Yeah. So with this, I would like to thank and open the floor.
It was a fascinating presentation. I'm going to open it up now for questions and comments. Dzmitry, can you stop sharing your slides? Okay, great, thank you. Bill Powers, floor is yours.
All right, thanks. Hope you can hear me. I just wanted to say, Dmitry, first of all, this is fantastic work. Dmitry and his group were kind enough to share some of this work a couple of years ago, and we did some looks at some papers on looking at U.S. Rules of origin. And without this kind of consistent work, there's almost nothing you can say systematically about rules of origin. And with this kind of work, you can say so many things. And so just wanted to start by saying thanks to you personally and the Center for getting this out there. So I think it's super interesting to consider using this information to unlock input-output relationships. And you were telling us how you can do that. I do have a question about what it is that we can't find here. I can just give you an example. The US negotiators generally don't include these exceptions or these exclusions for products that are not produced in the United States. Or maybe were not produced 15 years ago, because as you mentioned, there's some copying and pasting going on here. So I mean, maybe that's fine in an input-output relationship if we don't know what doesn't get used anyway. You know, if we're not identifying products that don't exist for use. So maybe, but what are the limitations of this approach that you've identified for tracing input-output relationships?
Thank you, Bill, for your words and for your question. Yes, so it's true that some inputs, they are not sensitive or they are not produced, and therefore they are not put on the restriction list. Such is the case in NAFTA for many industrial products and electronic products. But what we do is we leverage on all trade agreements in the world, 400 agreements, and in some agreements, those inputs will be sensitive. For example, in Africa or Asia, and they will show up on those lists. And that's where we can leverage to identify them as inputs. So here the strategy would be that even though one FTA might be missing and not reveal this information, when we take all the knowledge, all the FTAs in the world, somewhere it will show up, one way or another. Yeah, that was my answer. If you have any follow-up question.
Any further questions? Lars?
Yes, hello, and thank you, and thanks, Dmitry, for this work, which I also find to be fantastic. Getting closer to input-output relations at 6 digits is something that I have been wanting to put my hands on for a long period of time. Now, this is interesting in many aspects. You were mentioning trade creation, trade diversion, and what you can do with this type of relation. What you have here is, of course, to look into which of these origin rules seem to be more or less restricting use of preferences. Because if you think about it, if you say that these origin rules would cause trade diversion, they would cause trade diversion for a reason. and the reason would be to comply with the requirements to obtain trade preferences. So I think matching, I mean, if you find trade diversion as a result of these origin rules, on the other hand, I would expect to see full preference utilization for that particular relation. So it's just a comment, because I know that the work Paula did on NAFTA, they never looked at that. They found a 43% trade diversion, but whether these products actually used preferences on the US market is nothing they reported on. I looked at it later, and it seems like, yes, there was like an 85% preference utilization rate, but I think that link is important to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. So, so in Canconi, I think the argument was that even though they don't have preference utilization data, so they don't know how much of those trade flows were benefiting from NAFTA and which of them was just standard flows under MFN, they used a triple difference in difference. So they claimed that this would essentially eliminate this. It would allow to properly compare the increase in trade of and changes in trade of restricted inputs versus changes in trade in unrestricted inputs. And across the board, the only difference for such changes, absorbing all other fixed effects, would have to be because of this free trade, and consequently because of this rule of origin restriction. So the regression was across all the products, across PTA, non-PTA suppliers. And so, but if we had preference utilization data, we could, of course, get first of all simpler regression, and I think without going into triple differences. So the problem is preference utilization. So far, we only have a few countries. We have the European Union, US, at the national level, and I think Australia and Japan. And unfortunately, for other countries, this data is not as comprehensive as standard trade databases at 6-digit level.
You're muted, Mary.
Any further questions or comments? Well, Dzmitry, I want to thank you. It was really a fascinating presentation. You gave us a sense of the challenges of quantifying rules of origin and some of the limitations. You have accomplished such an important thing in terms of providing the data underpinnings for being able to look at the impacts of this kind of a trade measure. So thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody for participating, particularly our speakers, but also our audience. It was an excellent set of 4 papers, gave a lot of different dimensional views of PTAs. And so with that, we'll close the session and enjoy the rest of the conference.